Pozdravljeni, sem Marja Milič in poslušate MoneyHow, prvi podcast o upravljanju denarja pri nas.
Najprej bi se rada zahvalila vsem, ki so se udeležili dogodka MoneyHow Live. V živo smo se družili s poslušalci in gledalci podcasta MoneyHow in čeprav je debata super gosti trajala skoraj 3 ure, je občinstvo v nabito polni dvorani sedelo do zadnje minute. Najlepša hvala za to. Prejela sem tudi zelo veliko sporočil, če bomo dogajanje z dogodka objavili tudi v podcastu, da bomo. Potrebujem pa nekaj časa, da te 3 ure smiselno zmontiram in sestavim vsebino. Poleg redne službe mi enostavno včasih malce zmanjka časa za takšne zadeve, sploh za 3-urne zadeve. Pojavile so se tudi želje, da ponovno organiziram nek tak live dogodek. To bomo tudi organizirali in sicer enkrat po pomladanskih mesecih. Zaenkrat pa hvala vsem za podporo in hvala tudi, da poslušate MoneyHow. Gremo na današnjo epizodo. Že kar nekaj časa želim pripraviti epizodo o Kitajski. Volja do moči se je pokazala na zadnjem kongresu Kitajske komunistične partije, na katerim si je Xi Jinping, kitajski predsednik, zagotovil prijateljski 24-članski politbiro in 3. zaporedni mandat na čelu partije. Kaj to pomeni za prihodnost sveta? Čeprav se mogoče komu tu v naši deželi pod Alpami to ne zdi zanimivo ali pomembno, se moramo zavedati, da dogajanje na Kitajskem lahko zelo vpliva na naša življenja. Spomnimo se, kako je COVID pred skoraj 2 leti praktično ustavil svet. Na Kitajskem železna roka partije udriha tudi po uspešnih IT podjetjih in utiša vse tiste, ki štrlijo iz povprečja. Menda, da bo letos manj iPhonov na voljo za božične nakupe. Eden od razlogov so tudi okužbe s COVID-om in posledično zapiranje mesta, ker je locirana največja tovarna na svetu, tovarna iPhonov, oziroma nekateri temu tudi pravijo iPhone City. Poglejmo še malce na borzo. Denimo kitajski indeks Hang Seng je letos upadel za 30% v lokalni valuti, od vrha doseženega marca 2018 pa 45%. Nasdaq Golden Dragon China Index, ki spremlja kitajska podjetja na Nasdaqu, je letos upadel za 40%, od vrha, ki ga je dosegel februarja 2021, pa je upadel za kar 75% v lokalni valuti. Z menoj je Sašo Šmigič, ki je upravljalec premoženja pri Generali Investments. Vmes pa bo kitajsko politiko pokomentiral tudi Anastas Vangelin z katedre za mednarodno ekonomijo in poslovanje iz Ljubljanske ekonomske fakultete. Oba sogovornika sta odlična opazovalca dogajanja v Kitajskem, bolj pa bomo tokrat osredotočeni na ta investicijski del. Zdravo, Sašo.
Zdravo, Marja.
Gremo najprej pokomentirati ta zadnji kongres. Kaj se je zgodilo? Še bolj si je utrdil svoj položaj. Kako ti gledaš na to kot investitor, ki iščeš naložbe na Kitajskem?
Tako je. V bistvu je kapitalski trg globalno gledano veliko enih svojih upov polagal na ta kongres. Že na začetku leta, pa že konec lanskega leta je bilo veliko špekulacij o tem, kaj bo napovedan, kako se bo vse odvijalo. Zato, ker to je eno izmed v bistvu tako najpomembnejših obdobij v 5-letnem mandatu, ki ga ima na Kitajskem. Ponavadi je zelo tako režiseran, dost, recimo temu, uigran orkester, ki ga tam probuje predstaviti. No, v glavnem, svet se je znašel v nekem obdobju ohlajanja, velik del temu gre pripisovati tudi Kitajski. Glavni razlog temu je njihova zero COVID politika, kjer pomeni, da ne tolerirajo COVID-a, vsak manjši izbruh se tretira z lockdownom, se pravi zaprtjem, omejevanjem življenja itd., kar povzroča preglavice potem širom sveta preko teh omejenih transportnih, pa recimo temu trgovskih poti, izostanek materialov. Pa bomo videli tudi, kar si rekla za iPhone, to je vse del te iste zgodbe. Veliko upanja smo polagali v to, da bojo na tem kongresu naznanili konec te zero COVID politike, ker v bistvu so zadnja država, kjer ima še te rigorozne ukrepe. Veliko smo upali, da bojo malo več dali tudi, recimo temu, poudarka na možnih ukrepih glede stimuliranja gospodarske aktivnosti, da bi bila nekako predstavljena celotna recimo bližja prihodnost Kitajske v malo bolj svetli luči. Žal se je zgodilo pa ravno nasprotno. od tega malega uprizorjenega škandalčka z odstranitvijo bivšega premierja, z nekim pretiranim izkazovanjem moči obstoječega premierja, o tem, da ne nameravajo spreminjati politike glede COVID-a, tudi nekih večjih stimulusov, ki naj bi spodbudili gospodarsko aktivnost, ni bilo najavljenih. Tako da ja, kapitalski trg se je odzval na vse to zelo klavrno, no. Z velikimi odprodajami, in kitajski trg je dobesedno najslabši kapitalski trg, delniški trg, no, v letošnjem letu, vsaj kar se tiče teh večjih pomembnejših trgov. Tako da, če bi rekla, se je zgodil najslabši možen scenarij, ki smo ga predvideli, ne, je bil pa zelo blizu temu.
Ja, ampak vseeno je pa napovedal, da želi v bistvu Kitajsko spremeniti, v bistvu namigoval, da želi, da bi Kitajska postala svetovna velesila in pa tudi, da oboroži državo za morebitno konfrontacijo z Zahodom, ne?
Ja, mislim, treba se tudi zavedati, da vse informacije, ki jih dobimo na to tematiko, ne vem, politika, vojna, oboroževanje, sploh v zahodnem svetu jemljemo v kontekstu tega, kar se dogaja na naši vzhodni veji, ne, evropski, se pravi v konfliktu Ukrajine in Rusije, ker se nekako začnejo kazati določene vzporednice med recimo temi autokratskimi režimi, kot ga imajo v Rusiji. Ne pozabiti, v bistvu glavne težave v Rusiji so se začele ravno s tem tretjim mandatom gospoda Putina, ne, kjer je bilo prav tako potrebno spremeniti ustavo in marsikajšno zakonodajno ureditev, da tega sploh lahko prišlo. Predtem smo imeli podobno zgodbo v Turčiji z Erdoganom, spet nek tak zelo autokratski režim. In obe te zgodbi sta se danes izkazali kot negativni. Sploh za delničarje, ki so bili investirani v ta del sveta, porazno. In zdaj, ja, mogoče v tem kontekstu spet ta tretji mandat, malo izsiljen, posiljen Xi Jinpinga, spet možna konfrontacija na Tajvanu, dodatna zaostritev razmer do Zahoda, predvsem do Združenih držav Amerike, ker ne smemo pozabiti, da ta konflikt sploh trgovinski traja že od Trumpovega mandata naprej, ne, in da se z Bidenovo administracijo na tem področju ni nič spremenilo, kvečemo se mogoče poslabšali, pa še dodatno zaostrili. Tako da v tem kontekstu, ja, je vse to lahko zelo negativno. A pa do tega prišlo, pa težko rečem. Načeloma Kitajska vsaj v tej njeni daljši zgodovini nikoli ni delala nekih res nerazumnih potez. Recimo tak bi bil napad ali pa zauzetje Tajvana. Po drugi strani pa danes spet ne moramo reči, da je to nemogoče, zato ker smo tudi za Putina mislili, da je racionalen človek in da se bo odločil pač racionalno. Očitno se ni.
Dajva poslušati komentar še Anastasa na to temo.
Xi Jinping has consolidated his position as the head of China and Chinese Communist Party. How do you understand Xi's last move? What do you think about the Congress and everything that happened there?
Usually these congresses are considered to be not too dramatic, so everything could be predicted and everything is known well in advance. So there was one thing that was well known to everyone, it's that Xi Jinping is staying in power. So unlike in previous instances, after 2 terms, he continues to stay in power. What was not known is who will join him on the standing committee of the Politburo. To big surprise to most China observers, one American think tank did a poll ahead of the Congress, for people to make informed guesses who will be the top leaders. And I think out of more than 1,000 respondents, and these were all people who are closely following Chinese politics, there was no single correct answer, right? Because everyone expected to have at least someone who's from a different background, or rather different inclination than Xi Jinping. But the end result is that he's surrounded by loyalists. And aside from the selection of loyalists, what is surprising is that a lot of the rules and norms that were governing the process of leadership succession were simply overridden. I mean, the first such overriding was the fact that Xi Jinping was going to stay beyond the retirement age and beyond the informal limit of 2 terms. But the fact that, for instance, he promoted certain people by, fast-tracking them to top positions, or rewarding Li Qiang, who's now the number 2 and likely the incoming prime minister of China. Just as a background, Li Qiang was still is, he was until the Congress the party chief of Shanghai, and he was well known and also a bit infamous for the zero COVID measures. And, in the common sense, before that, you would assume that someone who has been exposed to criticism at home and abroad would not be promoted, but actually he was, which is an interesting sign. We can talk more in depth later because he's known also as a pro-business guy, but also as a Xi loyalist. So it's a very interesting situation. Bottom line, my takeaway from this Congress is that, the party makes a bet, by overriding these norms, it makes a bet because now it emphasizes stability, right? But it's not bluffing in a sense that, there are dangerous times ahead. So they rather, stick, closing the ranks around Xi Jinping, which can enable the party to, in a way, have almost, this rule by exception powers, right? So they can be very centralized and they can impose a very direct top-down policies if necessary, which of course is undoing a lot of the progress done before, but at the same time tells you what are their priorities.
And what are their priorities?
I think that the main priority is just to weather the multiple storms right now, right? So there's of course a big economic restructuring happening for some time now. There is a very tumultuous geopolitical context. This has been, of course, brewing for some time, but it has entered new stages after the war in Ukraine. And these two things combined, make for an unprecedented situation.
And what do you think will happen with Taiwan?
That's the problem, most critical question, right? Because, for China, Taiwan matters in several ways. Just pure geography, pure geographical argument, Taiwan is just there off the East Coast. And any crisis in Taiwan is a logistical paralysis of the most progressive part of China. The crisis there is something that is not too desirable, right? Then Taiwan matters, of course, in terms of history, legacy, all these political arguments about Chinese unity, unification of the country, the One China principle. And then, of course, Taiwan matters also because currently is a key, let's say, hotspot in the technological competition, right? As the semiconductor industries, the largest semiconductor producer, the most important one, at least for China, is in Taiwan. And on the other hand, Taiwan has been considered historically, this unsinkable aircraft carrier, as it was referred to in the Cold War by the U.S. Of course, during the period of engagement, the U.S. was not as imposing its interests in Taiwan, but it was always there. However, it's been considered by the U.S. as a very useful, if I may say, instrument in the struggle against China. We've seen this year with the trip by Nancy Pelosi, the U.S. can easily change the agenda and impose a certain discourse just like with one trip by a politician, right? So, and we've seen by the reaction by China, who initiated military drills ever closer to the shores of Taiwan, that it's not going to take lightly any such moves as well. So it's not a simple situation.
Na Tajvanu imajo eno veliko tovarno, Taiwan Semiconductors. Kako bo zdaj s tem, kaj se dogaja? Si mogoče kaj bil pozoren na dogajanje?
Ja, sej to zgodba s temi mikroprocesorji oziroma čipovjem ni nič novega. V bistvu to je glavno jedro spora in se vleče že zadnjih, 7, 8 ali pa celo več let. Je pa v bistvu izvor vsega tega želja ali pa napoved Kitajske, da naj bi postala v naslednjih 10 letih globalna tehnološka velesila. Se pravi, dobesedno naj bi na tem področju prevzela primat Ameriki, Združenih držav Amerike. In ja, zelo veliko kapitala se je zlival v ta segment na Kitajskem. Mogoče so v eni točki tukaj Američani zaspali in se zdaj situacija rešuje malo na silo v zadnjem momentu in so te tenzije še bistveno večje, kot bi bile mogoče, če bi se stvari odvijale prej ali pa bolj razumno. Tako da ja, dejstvo je, da se je celotna industrija mikroprocesorjev skoncentrirala na enem majhnem otoku v Kitajskem morju, ki se mu reče Tajvan. In da je cel svet dejansko odvisen od tega, kaj se tam proizvaja. In čeprav bi se Američani želeli, da bi se ta industrija lahko takole preslikala v Ohio, Texas, Arizono ali kamorkoli drugam, to pač čez noč ne gre. Kitajski odnos do Tajvana je znan, oni mislijo, da je to njihovo območje, tako da ja, situacija je zelo sporna, no? Ampak ni nova, ni povezana s Tajvanom, s tajvanskim kontaktorjem, je povezana s tem bolj ideološko zamislijo, pa ne samo zamislijo, ampak se stvari že odmaterializirajo tudi v realni ekonomiji in v samem segmentu razvoja tehnoloških teh procesov, aplikacij, mikroprocesorjev, kjer Kitajska res dela velike korake in ja, verjamem, da gre to vsem Američanom, zato ker se res lahko zgodi, da se želje Kitajske uresničijo, no? In da bomo v bistvu v 5 do 10 letih videli Kitajsko kot tehnološko velesilo. Ne samo ekonomsko, ampak tudi tehnološko, kar do zdaj ni bila.
Ravno ta teden je na Kitajskem svetovna internetna konferenca, kjer naj bi se zbrali vsi ti največji moguli iz IT panoge. Že lansko leto smo imeli to konferenco in takrat so v bistvu te podjetniki, moguli dali podporo Šiju in pa njegovemu boju za to skupno blaginjo. Ne. S tem, zelo so tako, se mi zdi, da delujejo tako po nareku partije, no, tudi te podjetniki.
Dobesedno brez podpore partije tam ne moreš uspeti. To je dejstvo. Ne dobiš kapitala, ne odprejo se ti marsikatera vrata. Tako da ja, ta primer Alibabe in Jacka Maja v bistvu pokazal ne samo Kitajski, ampak širom sveta, vsem ljudem na svetu, kdo je glavni in kaj se zgodi, če pač stopiš korak levo ali desno iz scenarija. Pač režiser prekine film, ustavi se snemanje in če pač še ponovnem pogovoru igralec noče odigrati dane vloge, se zamenja igralca, tako kot pri filmski produkciji, tako pač je. In žal na Kitajskem to pomeni, da vsi ti njihovi velikani tehnološki, ki so bile v bistvu glavne zvezde delniškega trga, dejansko zdaj trpijo za posledicami tega, ker določeni igralci niso hoteli več igrati po pravilih, ki so jih napisali. Pač. Te, ki so jim omogočili, pa so ratali najmogočnejši, pa najbolj.
What is your opinion about IT industry in China? This week in China is the World Internet Conference where moguls from IT industry are expected to gather. So how do you see IT sector and Xi Jinping?
Yeah, I mean, this is also a very crucial question. I think this Internet Conference this year will be, I mean, there is always like this show-off, right? What China has achieved in terms of innovation, and it's mind-blowing. You know, we must not forget that, you know, when it comes to Industry 4.0, China is at the forefront. Like, I wouldn't say number one, it's too big of a statement, but, you know, every past historical, you know, industrial revolution, you know, China was always a laggard. And here China is among the leaders. So there's always this show-off moment. But I think this year it will be also about sending a political message. And this is in light of the US-China tensions, in particular, you know, the tech war. So we know historically in recent years what happened with, let's say, Huawei, ZTE, these Chinese tech giants who actually made important leaps in developing cutting-edge technology, were excluded for their, you know, unreliability, untrusted vendors, as they're referred to, right? So they were excluded from many Western markets per the request or per the initiative, the Clean Network and similar initiatives by the US. And we've seen the hit on semiconductor industry just before the Congress, right? So this Chips and Science Act that the US has initiated has really been you know, throwing the gauntlet on Chinese, basically Industry 4.0 ambitions, because without good semiconductors, you cannot develop other, you know, everything else. So I think this year's the conference will be about delivering this message that China is doubling down on investment in R&D, trying to actually get foreign knowledge, foreign experts, foreign companies, trying to also harmonize the market with the platform economy, with digital payments and so on. Trying maybe to mend fences. We've seen previous instances of crackdowns on big tech companies. So I think it will be more of a, signaling a new, let's say, or a new chapter, trying to kickstart a new momentum, create a new momentum for the tech industry in China. Which is, of course, very hard thing to do, but I don't think CCP has a choice. If they really want to remain competitive and continue, and because exports now are really their lifeline, especially, tech exports. So this is the thing to do right now.
Do you think it will be more controlled by Communist Party and Xi, IT sector and the companies, and of course entrepreneurs there? We have to probably remember Jack Ma and what happened to him.
Yes. The China of the last few years and China of the next few years, if not decade or longer, is a China where, we have this paradigm shift. It's not China Inc., it's CCP Inc. So, of course, the national strategy, or rather the party strategy, is the guiding, provides the guiding vision for the tech sector. But it also provides a lot of, incentives, provides a lot of generous provisions. But there is no doubt, now there's not even, I think China never pretended to be like this Western style economy, but now there is, in China, this is seen as a good thing, right? When the party shows its commitment. And I think right now they're really committed to boosting technological innovation.
But how do you see this from an investor's point of view? Because investors have some bad experience with investing in IT in China.
So, investing in China is a double-edged sword these days. Bottom line is China remains overall competitive. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why investors are still considering China. There is a lot of incentives and a lot of these are intangible incentives. Just the infrastructure, the promise of the Chinese market. It's still like the huge market, huge potential. The promise of using China as a gateway to Asia and so on. So these things still stand there. The fact that if you're in the tech business, you can actually have a lot of benefits from these new policies that will be enacted. On the other hand, you face a very regulated environment, also politically regulated. With gloves are off. So if you're a big company, you have to have a party committee in your company, right? And you always have to be in accord with what the party says. You cannot criticize. You cannot try to confront. On top of that, there is this geopolitical conflict, and this, let's say, Chips and Science Act has a lot of ramifications for Western companies doing business with China in semiconductors, and it's plausible to think that this will affect many other industries. So as there is this tendency for a big polarization, I wouldn't go on to say decoupling, but I think it's an overused term, but certainly polarization in the global economy. I think, you'll be frowned upon if also in the domestic, especially if you're an American company, right? So investing in China raises an eyebrow. On the other hand, let's say if you're a European company, we've seen that, lately there has been some uptick in doing business with China, both in terms of selling European assets, European companies investing in China. So, which is a consequence of changing environment also in Europe. That's why I'm saying, China will have this edge, and for the time being, it will be tough, but, we'll have these conversations and we'll observe, right? So it's there to stay.
Ravno danes sem gledala po Bloombergu, če so kakšne zadnje novice vezano na Jack Ma pa na Ant Group. Ravno včeraj je Ant Group objavil, da so našli nek način za plačevanje s QR-kodo izven meja Kitajske, da bi nekaj bilo na podoben način kot Mastercard in Visa. To je neka noviteta.
Ja, ne, seveda da migajo. To je tako. ogromno tehnološko podjetje, ki še zmeraj zelo dobro posluje, ki se ni ustavil. Problem sam je, da so zdaj delničarji oziroma kapitalski trg je ugotovil ali pa ne ugotovil. Te dvomi so se porajali že prej. Da od vsega tega tehnološkega napredka in vseh teh inovacij in stvari, ki jih tam delajo, delničarji na koncu lahko ne bodo dobili nič ali pa mogoče zelo malo. Zdaj, da to ni izolirana zgodba, se kaže, ne vem, če sam pogledamo vrednotenja, ki so, recimo, če primerljivo podjetje v Ameriki in na Kitajskem, je vrednotenje bistveno nižje. Ne? Zakaj je vrednotenje nižje? Če pogledamo PE kazalec, zato, ker je na Ameriki velika verjetnost, da bodo delničarji nekaj imeli od tega EA, od imenovalca, se pravi Drnixov. Na Kitajskem je pa ta imenovalec pod vprašajem. Zakaj? Zato, ker to ni glavna prioriteta komunistične partije. Glavna prioriteta komunistične partije je tehnološki razvoj, zaposlenost, inovacije in če na koncu nekaj ostane delničarjem super, če pa ne, pa več sreče prihodnjič. In to se odraža na vrednotenjih in zaradi tega imajo te delnice oziroma tudi te trgi generalno pač niže vrednotenje. V primerjavi s trgi, kjer je dostopnost do teh dobičkov pač recimo temu bolj verjetna. Zato so recimo tudi ruske delnice kotirale na price earnings, 3-5, kar je bilo 5-krat niže od primerjavi z zahodnimi peri. Glede zaradi tega, ker je bil vprašaj imenovalca tako velik. Ne?
Po drugi strani pa v bistvu partija tudi nekako nemogoča, da bi kitajske družbe kotirale izven Kitajske, oziroma si želijo, da bi kotirale seveda na Kitajskem. To smo videli na primeru Ant Groupa. Kako zdaj, kaj se bo zgodilo? Ne vem. Zdaj, ko gledava želje pač podjetnikov, na drugi strani partija, to je vse ena taka velika velesila, močna država, ki lahko zelo kroji naše življenje, konec koncev.
Ja, in ga kroji.
Ja.
Treba se tudi zavedati, ali pa recimo, da malo služimo znanje, da zakaj točno gre malo širši zgodbi. Tukaj gre za dva zelo različna koncepta globalizacije in kapitalizma. Govorim različna koncepta med Zahodom in Vzhodom. Zahod predstavlja Združene države Amerike, kjer pač globalizacija in kapitalizem poteka preko korporacij in v bistvu korporacije alocirajo kapital, akumulirajo dobičke in tako naprej. Na Kitajskem je pa ta distribucija kapitala, pa lokacija kapitala usmerjena strani pač države, ne? In so podjetja potem v drugem planu. Tako da je tudi za kapitalski trg to čisto drugačna igra, kot jo imamo na Zahodu. Ne? Tudi z tem njihovim Belt and Road inicijativo, se pravi, ki širijo svojim vplivom na Zahod, zelo velik projekt, o tem se ne govori več toliko, kot bi se mogli, je ravno to, ne? Se pravi, kitajska vlada preko investira svoj kapital, pa daje alocira kapital in daje posojila drugim vladam. Ne? Se pravi, gre za lokacijo kapitala med politiki, medtem ko Amerika pač preko svojih korporacij širi to globalno hobotnico. Tako da tudi zaradi tega je mogoče kapitalski trg v drugem planu na Kitajskem, kot je recimo na Zahodu. Zavedajo se, da je potreben zaradi takih ali drugačnih razlogov, ampak definitivno ni tako pomemben, kot je recimo v Ameriki. Tudi ta wealth effect je v Ameriki zelo povezan s tem, kaj se dogaja na delniških trgih. Ne? Zakaj? Zato, ker je veliko njihove pokojnine vezano na to, kaj se dogaja na kapitalskih trgih v cenah delnicah. Na Kitajskem je ta wealth effect povezan primarno z nepremičninskim trgom. Se pravi, tam jim je bolj pomembno kot to, kaj se dogaja na borzi, kaj se dogaja z njihovo, recimo temu, vrednostjo nepremičnin in dostopnostjo do nepremičnin. Tako da ja, recimo temu različna svetova in različno dojemanje tega, kaj je pomembno, pa kaj ne.
Ja, pri nepremičninah nedavno smo pisali na Bloomberg Adriji prav to, da so v nekaterih provincah ukazali, da morajo prodajalci znižati cene nepremičnin za petino. Nekje sem celo zasledila, da se rušijo mesta duhov. Tudi so tiste gradnje, ki so jih masovno gradili za ljudi, ki jih tam noter ni. In menda, da se zdaj to podira, zato da se ponovno gradi in spodbuja ta cikl nepremičninski.
Ja, to so take, recimo temu, zelo zanimive podmevne medijske zgodbe, ki pač so tako malo pompozne. Gradijo se mesta duhov, rušijo se mesta duhov. Treba se pa zavedati, da na Kitajskem stvari delajo plansko. Se pravi, zakaj so sploh začeli graditi ta mesta duhov, oziroma prazna mesta. Na Kitajsko so imeli dolgo časa politiko enega otroka. Pač starši, kakršni so preferirali pač moške potomce. In v določeni točki je prišlo do, recimo temu, demografske anomalije, kjer je bilo za vse te moške potomce kar naenkrat premalo potencialnih partnerk. In ponudba in povpraševanje se je začela izvajati in te potencialne partnerke oziroma njeni starši so imeli na izbiro kar naenkrat veliko snubcev. In seveda v prvi plan so prišli tisti snubci, ki so imeli dobro izobrazbo, se pravi dobro službo in pa nepremičnino. In v končni fazi je ta stvar eskalirala v tem, da so starši, ki so imeli doma pač sina, ki je bil še majhen otrok, varčevali celo življenje, da so lahko temu sinu, ko bo pač dopolnil določeno starost, se pravi, da bo bil pripravljen na ženo, da bo imel že na lagarčku eno svoje stanovance, s katero bo pač si lahko, recimo tega, dvignil verjetnost, da bo prišel do žene in da se bo pač nadaljeval njihov rod. In skladno s tem se je gradil tako ogromna količina nekih mest, ki so bila prazna zaradi tega, ker pač te otroče niso dozoreli, da bi lahko tam živeli.
Vse to zgodbo smo že slišali. Matevž Raškovič, ki je živel na Kitajskem, nam je to zelo natančno razložil.
Tako da v glavnem za Kitajsko, če povzamemo, je bistveno bolj pomembno, kaj se dogaja na nepremičninskem trgu, kot kar se dogaja na kapitalskem trgu. S tem, da spet kapitalski kitajski trg je treba gledati z dveh koncev. En je pač to, kar se dogaja znotraj meja Kitajske, se pravi notranji kitajski trg, pa to, kar se dogaja zunaj meja Kitajske, se pravi Hongkong in pa vsi ADR-ji pa GDR-ji na londonskih in pa predvsem na ameriških borzah. Zato, ker je tudi struktura vlagateljev na teh dveh trgih popolnoma različna. In ne odražata včasih v bistvu iste dinamike.
And what do you think about the real estate market in China? It's cooling off.
I think this is part of the big economic restructuring, right? So, and I think this was a very much premeditated thing, and this reveals a lot about the mindset of Xi Jinping and where China is going, because, I mean, first of all, it caught many people by surprise. So, basically, the real estate sector, I mean, it's the biggest asset class in the world, right? By far. It's like, in relative terms, it's twice bigger, like than in nominal terms, it's absolutely gigantic and much larger than the US one, but also in relative terms, it's double the size of the US, let's say, real estate. I mean, compared to GDP, right? So, and it was overheated for sure. Prices were insane, and the thing is, you just need to see what Xi Jinping said at the Congress. He reiterated the message he's been saying before. Apartments should be for living, not for speculating, right? So the CCP was very much aware of how unsustainable the sector was. A lot of loans, like driven by borrowing from the future, right? A lot of, people just putting their money in the apartments, empty apartments just being there. And it was generating numbers of growth, but it was not reliable. And I think at some point they realized that sooner or later this can have really detrimental effects if there is a meltdown. So they opted to tackle the problem first, right? So they introduced certain measures to discourage further, let's say, borrowing, further investment, and this led to several crises. And I mean, to the cooling off. I mean, which now is a good thing for buyers, right? I mean, lower real estate prices, although this affects also financial, now it's much tougher to get a loan. But anyway, I think the most important goal for the CCP was to phase out this kind of, to phase out in terms of importance, the real estate sector from the growth model, right? Because this was considered to be unhealthy, unreliable, unsustainable growth. This meant settling for lower growth for the time being, which is a shock. And this is something completely new to everyone, something that can be very well justified in ideological terms, maybe. If you read Xi Jinping, very socialist flavor of his speech. I mean, not just one speech, like he has volumes of books of speeches, right? So, and these are consistent ideas for 10 years now. Also practically, I think it has been a way to kind of stimulate this economic culture shift, right? Because I think it's been considered a zombie sector, right? You have money, you put in endless buildings, but this is not productive investment, right? So now the idea is to somehow stimulate people to think of, investing in something else, something that can actually have more tangible benefits. However, I have no idea what's next. This is a complicated situation. I think they so far have been able to manage it, or they have been crafty enough to keep it out of the debate. At some point with Evergrande, there was all over the news. Now people talk less, but it's still there. Prices are still going down. We'll see what happens next.
Interesting. I think that real estate is really tangible investment. In cryptocurrencies, they're not allowed to invest.
Yeah, I mean, cryptocurrency is a whole different level. But no, you would see, if you take a train in China, and you see like endless buildings upon buildings upon buildings, and that this is, someone laundered money, right? That someone, it was just done, someone had excess money, they didn't know what to do. So this was the first thing they did. And I think this was not considered something that brings benefits to the country. For some time it pumped the numbers. The construction industry was booming and so on. Half of those ghost towns will be populated, right? There's still a lot of rural population. And I think, right now there is still much oversupply of apartments, but, it can be still managed. But if this trend would continue, and this is what they wanted to stop, and I think they're managing somehow to slow it down, what you're going to do then with all those empty apartments.
COVID is also not a simple situation, especially zero COVID policy. China has an extremely harsh policy of curbing the spread of COVID. Do you think that the leadership of the Communist Party is using COVID as an instrument to, maybe control society or people?
I mean, looking from this side of the world, it can be really difficult to comprehend. In talking to my friends in China, sometimes it's really difficult to make sense of all that. I mean, there are at least a couple of explanations, some more plausible than the others, right? Let's say on the formal, if we want to give the benefit of the doubt of the voices in China who justify these zero COVID measures is, let's say people who say, the core argument is, we value human life, right? So, China does not want to have any excess mortality. And, on top of that is aware of the weaknesses and holes in the public healthcare system. So it cannot allow any, further contagion that may lead to scenes like we've seen in the first, weeks of the pandemic in Wuhan and what we've seen around the world ever since. And then there is, of course, the moral superiority argument. We're a socialist country. We care about human life and so on. There is also there was this viral speech by a consultant in China who said, if China wants to outcompete the West, it should just sit back and relax and stick to zero COVID measures, because the prolonging effects of the pandemic, which the West has been pretending that is over, right? And the long COVID effects, so not just the casualties, but also the long COVID, which impairs human health, will have detrimental consequences further on. This, of course, can be interpreted as kind of cheerleading for the party, right? So take it with a grain of salt. And of course, the paranoia argument is there. Even the corruption argument is there. PCR testing is a huge business in China, and all those, it's a whole economy of combating COVID now emerging. So maybe in some places people have special interest. The fact that, the National Party Congress was a big milestone. So, they needed to ensure that there is some, things are under control, both in terms of outbreaks, but also in terms of having political control. The trial and error of new measures of political control is there. So it's difficult to say, maybe with some historical evidences, we'll know more about the reasoning, and whether this was a smart decision or not. Right now, it's baffling. especially because the severe economic effect, but also political effects. You've seen people actually protesting, not massively. Of course, they cannot do that in China, but more important, people voicing their dissatisfaction, people trying to just get out of China, the more progressive, more educated people, Western expats, and so on. How to gauge this? There's always this assumption that Chinese leaders know what they're doing, so they have to have their logic, right? But beyond the speculation, it's hard to conclude what it is.
Yeah, but we do have lockdowns of cities and provinces, and it does have negative effect on the economy, not only in China, but also globally. For example, iPhone City, or the factory in the city, which actually, I'm not sure if it was closed or not. I'm not sure about that, but the city, I know it's in lockdown, and the airport.
Yeah, so this was in I think you're referring to Foxconn factory in Zhengzhou, which is basically the biggest assembly line for Apple, because this is where a lot of components and iPhones are being made. And we've seen the footage of people breaking out of the living facilities and just going by foot to their hometowns and so on, which was, I think it was remarkable, that we saw it. I think there was a bit of loss of faith of authorities. So I'd be curious to see, whenever something like that happens, someone on the local level, heads will roll. It's never the center. Like, the center is the one who imposes sanction, but some local level official will surely be punished for that. But I think it's interesting, how this plays out. Apple is particularly concerned with this because it's a major interruption in production, in supply chains and so on. But I think paradoxically, this makes Apple, much more of a stakeholder in China, so Apple now has an interest in stability, things functioning, right? Not just sooner reopening, but it's in Apple's interest to now go with the flow with the government and see how these things can be resolved. So yeah, the zero COVID plays in interesting ways. I'm saying this because, it's really hard to divest, especially, when you have this facility in Zhengzhou. I think for Apple, it'd be much simpler still, besides this kind of disruption, to find their way to make things better in China rather than to pull out.
Se govori, da bo za božič zmanjkalo, oziroma da bo toliko manj iPhone-ov na voljo, ravno zaradi tega, ker se je zgodil lockdown 7-dnevni v mestu, kjer je ta tovarna, največja tovarna na svetu iPhone-ov. Si mogoče kaj spremljal to dogajanje?
Spet ima ta zgodba dva obraza. Jaz verjamem, da je veliko teh disrupcij v globalnih trgovskih poteh posledica teh lockdownov na Kitajskem. Zelo velika verjetnost je pa, da se tudi veliko zahodnih podjetij malo korišča s tovrstno situacijo. Recimo, zelo fino reči, da je omejena ponudba in da stvari niso na voljo, tem ustvari recimo, navidezno pomanjkanje agregatne ponudbe po nečem, prepričaš kupce, da pa dajmo, zdaj pa res bo zmanjkalo, ni, in potem lahko mogoče za to zaračunaš, višjo ceno. Recimo v avtomobilski industriji je zelo lep primer, ker naenkrat nisi mogel dobiti avta pod določenim nivojem opreme, se pravi, so bila na voljo samo temu bolj premijska vozila za bistveno višjo ceno in so potem podjetja izkazala ob relativno nižjih prihodkih bistveno večje dobičkonosnosti. Tako da, ne vem, če pogledam ta iPhone 14, to je dosti, ko se reče memes.
Mimi.
Ja, je to, Ja, primerjajo 13 ko 14, pa v bistvu vidijo, da kaj pa je kle novega, Lahko je tudi kle na tem področju kakšna malo tako zgodba. Ja, pa jih ne bo, pa dajte raje to hitro kupiti, pa pod posebnimi cenami. Ja, lahko pa, da jih tudi ne bo fizično zaradi štrajkov, zaradi lockdownov.
No, zdaj, ko smo pri iPhonu, pri pospeševanju prodaje, mogoče bi tukaj samo še Tesla omenila, ker Tesla konkretno je pa tudi zdaj že dvakrat najprej znižal za 5% ceno oktobra, zdaj so pa do konca leta, to se pravi novembra, so pa dali do konca leta nek hud popust na Tesle, ki so na zalogi. Mislim, da čez $1,000, $1,100 za nakup Tesle. Na Kitajskem seveda. Kako lahko pa to razumemo?
Zdaj nisem strokovnjak čisto točno za Teslo, ampak kolikor poznam zgodbo avtomobilske industrije, tako globalna, ali pa recimo ne globalna, bomo rekli temu zahodnoevropska avtomobilska industrija ustvari večinoma svojih dobičkov v emerging Aziji, kar bistveno pomeni na Kitajskem. Tako da lahko je zgodba podobna tudi s Teslo, ne vem. Mislim, glede na to, kaj se ustanovitelj pa glavni delničar, v kakšnih vode se je podal zdaj, pa koliko nekih, recimo temu, stroškov si je nakupil, mogoče potrebuje dodatni denar, ne vem.
Kako si lepo povedal, stroškov si nakupil, ja. Je bil par investicij vmes, ne?
Tako, določene odločitve vmes so bile mogoče malo, recimo, na prvi pogled čudne, ali pa recimo temu ne čisto racionalne, pa da zdaj rab kakšen dolar več, ne vem. Lahko je predtem dvignil ceno Tesel, ne vem, tako kot pred Black Fridayem na neke nivoje, pa zdaj ponuja popust. Ne vem. Dejstvo je pač, da avtomobilska industrija tradicionalno, že zadnjih 10, 15, 20 let večino profita ustvarja na Kitajskem. Tako da, no, če se tam stvari ustavijo, potem pač se bo ustavila tudi dobičkonosnost teh zahodnih avtomakerjev. Ne vem pa, kakšna je točna zgodba s Teslo.
No, se to je ravno zanimivo vprašanje. Če se tam ustavi, če se tam ohlaja v bistvu povpraševanje, če bomo imeli nižjo gospodarsko rast, če bodo ljudje kupovali manj električnih avtomobilov, se bo to tudi odrazilo na Zahodu.
Definitivno se bo to odrazilo na Zahodu. Tudi ne samo to, ne, ampak kar opažamo, ne vem, tudi že od Trumpove administracije naprej je bila ta težnja po temu, da naj make America great again, let's bring business back to USA. Podobne stavke ali pa teze smo slišali tudi na Zahodu, v vzhodni Evropi. Se pravi, da bi vrnili nek del industrije, ki smo jo v zadnjih, ne vem, 20-30 letih outsourcali v Azijo, primarno Kitajsko, zdaj pripeljali nazaj. Jaz vedno pol vprašam, ok, v redu, ampak kaj pa to pol pomeni, ne? Če boš ti, ne vem, iPhone pripeljal, ne vem, iz Apple Cityja na Kitajskem, kjer dobesedno ljudi delajo, ne vem, 24 ur na dan, ne? Tudi na YouTubeu je kakšen dokumentarc, kakšne nevzdržne razmere delujejo, mislim, so tam pri teh zaposlenih, zdaj pa ti prines to, ne vem, v Ohio ali pa v Michigan. Ja, in ta iPhone, ki že danes stane $1000, ne, bo pol stal $5000, ne? A smo tudi to pripravljeni pol kupiti, ali ne? Tako da ni samo to, kaj se tam dogaja z njihovo gospodarsko aktivnostjo, oni bojo te stvari bistveno lažje preživeli, kot mi, če se stvari pač ločijo na levo pa na desno polovico sveta, zato ker imajo domači trg toliko močen, da bo pač z domačim povpraševanjem prišlo do neke normalne ali pa neke naravne rasti, v tem, kar mi na Zahodu bomo imeli pa bistveno težje težave. Ne samo, če se tam ustavijo, ker so že zdaj glavni driver globalnega GDP-ja, ampak če se uresničijo te želje politiko, da ne bi pač del outsourcane proizvodnje vrnili domov. Da potem lahko pričakujemo podobne ukrepe tudi, ali pa poročilne ukrepe tudi strani Kitajske. Ne? Prav, ok, v redu. Vi hočete vzeti proizvodno iz naših fabrik v Ameriko ali pa Evropo, ja, potem pa tudi Tesla pa BMW ne boste kle prodajali. Ne?
Zdaj gremo dotakniti se gospodarske rasti, zdaj smo že večkrat omenila, letos naj bi se rast kitajskega gospodarstva počasnila na 2,8%, to je kar precejšen upad iz leta 2021, ko je bila gospodarska rast 8,1%. Mnogi pač ne zaupajo v to uradno statistiko. Kakšna je dejansko sploh res gospodarska rast Kitajske?
Težko reči, zato ker ja, že do zdaj te statistični podatki niso bili verodostojni, oziroma veliko ljudi to je malo zmero
skepse,
ja. Zdaj v luči zadnje dogajanje pa vse skupaj še bolj tako zavito v neko tančico skrivnosti, tako da ne bi niti upal ugibati, kje te številke so. Kar je Kitajska pokazala do zdaj je, da so sposobni pač stvari obrniti, da so sposobni narediti bistveno več, kot smo mogoče sposobni mi v Evropi, z odločnimi potezami, z raznimi stimulativnimi ukrepi. vemo, da je bil glavni driver kitajske gospodarske rasti pač povezan z državnim spendingom, se pravi z investicijami države. Z tem so zgradili ogromno infrastrukturo in to je v bistvu pač poganjalo celotno kitajsko ekonomijo zadnjih, recimo, 30 let. Se pravi industrializacija in pa urbanizacija. Ja, res je, v zadnjih 3, 4, 5 letih se ta dva trenda ustavljata, ampak še zmeraj je dosti lufta, če hočejo lahko v letu ali dveh pač plasirajo ogromno kapitala v ta segment in pač zbildajo ta GDP growth do mere, ki jo potrebujejo. Tako da to je tudi ena od teh stvari, ki sem govoril že na začetku, ne, da nekaj v tej luči smo pričakovali od tega kongresa, ki je potekel zdaj, neko napoved nekega stimulusa, ki ne bi vsaj tako kratkoročno prikazal bolj svetlo sliko za kitajsko gospodarsko rast. Žal temu še ni bilo. Ampak ja, predstavljam si pa, da če se bodo stvari še dodatno zaostrovale, da imajo na voljo orodja, s katerimi lahko pač te stvari stimulirajo in ja, v preteklosti so že večkrat pokazali, da so jih pripravljeni tudi uporabiti.
Zdaj, velja pravilo oziroma rek, če kihne Amerika, se prehladi cel svet, ampak enako lahko rečemo, da če kihne Kitajska, se lahko absolutno prehladi, ali pa paše kakšen virus tudi cel svet, ne. Ampak daj samo ta scenarij malo preigrajva. Če pride do recimo recesije na Kitajskem, kaj to pomeni za cel svet?
Za Kitajsko bi lahko rekli, da so že zdaj v recesiji, ne? Zato ker to, kar se jim je zgodilo letos, se jim ni zgodilo v bistvu v zadnjih 20 letih še nikoli. Tako da neke številke so bile, to so verjetno malo starejše že, ampak pred časom je bilo tako, da če so padali pod 4% GDP-ja, se jim je toliko zaustavil trg dela, pa tak v bistvu tak zaustavitev pospeška rasti je bil, da so se stvari začele ohladiti do te mere, da ne bi pač se začeli, da so se malo zapletel, ampak zgodba na Kitajskem je taka, da se vse vrti okoli tega konstantnega napredka pri celotni družbi. Se pravi, vse je vezano na zaposlovanje in pa na plačo. In če se gospodarska aktivnost v državi ustavi do te mere, da se upočasni zaposlovanje, bog ne dej, da celo prije do nekega reza zaposlenosti, potem lahko to povzroča pač socialno stisko pri posameznikih in s tem se pač zamaja zaupanje v vodstvo, v odločitve vodstva, sploh v verodostojnost tega, kar delajo. In to je v bistvu glavna skrb, po mojem razumevanju, kitajske partije. Se pravi, njihova glavna naloga je, da se življenjski standard prebivalca konstantno izboljšuje. Ker v tem primeru ne bodo imeli težave z, kako se reče temu, omejevanjem svoboščin, z nadaljevanjem obstoječega režima, kakorkoli, s tem pač kar delajo. In ja, mislim, da na trenutni točki pač smo klene, da zaposlovanje je pač v upadu. Zaradi tega ne verjamem, da bodo pustili, da se situacija v njih doma še dodatno zaostri. Kar veliko enih vprašanj v temu, ali je pač trenutna pot, po kateri hodijo pravilno ali ne, ali obstaja kakšna boljša.
Chinese economic growth is declining from 2021, but many don't have faith in official statistics. What do you think about that? Is the economic growth, the numbers, are they realistic?
Yeah, I mean, how was the saying? There lies, damn lines in statistics, right? So and Chinese statistics especially have been always scrutinized by experts. So I'm in no position to comment on how true they are. But what even the official statistics confirm that there is a decline in numbers. And I think the mere fact that we have those statistics is, again, a very surprising thing, something you would not expect, especially not from someone like Xi Jinping, who's portraying himself to be the big, caretaker of the Chinese nation, leading to national rejuvenation, right? So it's especially in a year of a party congress, and there's a twofold reason why the party would be, in our previous common sense, they would be afraid to release not so good numbers in a congress year. First, of course, there is the fear of losing face in front of the Chinese people, right? Because the part of the social contract of China used to be that there will be growth and growth and growth, and this is the source of legitimacy of the Communist Party. But then on the other hand, in a Congress year, all these officials on the local level, on the provincial level, they're competing to get promoted. And one of the key indicators for someone's success was to produce high growth levels. And the fact that, there are lower numbers, but also, following up on what I said earlier, the settling down for this slower, healthier growth, as it said. I mean, I don't even know what slower, healthier growth should mean, but this is the syntagm, right? This is the phrase. It could be a coping mechanism. I don't know. But it suggests that the logic has shifted, right? The social contract itself is shifting. And you also have to take in account a lot of, let's say, redistributive policies. Now companies being not coerced, but strongly encouraged to channel money into socially, not CSR like in the West, but really social projects, communal projects, and so on. Coupled with the tackling of the gray rhinos, right? Not waiting for these risks for let's say the housing market to melt down, but preemptively tackling it. So this speaks about the paradigm change. And I think at the same time one has to take the global context into perspective. I think Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership now is not so much. It's still concerned about domestic legitimacy, but it's also seeing how all this plays out on a global stage. And even if you take into account this lower growth, China is still better performing than the Western economies during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not where it would want to be ideally, but it's still better off. And, the prospects for the West are not so good. And, I think Xi Jinping has taken this as a window of opportunity to, in a way, try these different things. And again, trial and error, experimentation, a big thing that is often overlooked in China. They're not afraid to try new approaches, especially if, they see that something is not working well. So it's again, I cannot emphasize the element of surprise and novelty. And I think it will take some time for us to make sense out of all of this. I mean, and we don't know where this is going. Of course, the fact that the country is closed off, so we cannot really go there, talk to people anymore, is becoming really hard to predict. So I don't know, maybe in 2 weeks we're going to see something that will completely contradict me, but I think there will be some prolonged time of this uncertainty. But bottom line is, many other sectors are continuing to work in China. I mean, they're manufacturing, export, even besides zero COVID, even beside, geopolitical tensions. I think these things will continue to work and be the lifeline of the Chinese economy.
Na začetku sem omenila Dragon Index Nasdaqov. Recimo, zdaj marsikdo bo rekel, da 75% je upadel. A je to zdaj priložnost, da recimo kupimo na tej borzi ta indeks?
Kar se je začelo dogajati dobre 2-3 leta nazaj, je to, da so v Ameriki sprejeli zelo rigorozne pogoje glede investiranja v kitajske delnice. In Kitajska se je na to odzvala s tem, da je dobesedno vse, mislim, da je še par imen ostalo, izključno na ameriškem trgu. No, v glavnem, večinoma teh ameriških zgodb je preselila v Hong Kong. Tako da to je prva stvar in bojim se, da je to kar en indic trajnega decouplinga, da se tisto dogajanje preko Atlantika oziroma Pacifika, tam na Kitajskem, počasi oddaljuje od Kitajske same in da je recimo v tem nekem postopku počasnega umiranja in da se bo življenje pa ta prava dinamika Kitajske odražala primarno. Se bojim tudi v Hongkongu ne, ampak prav na Shenzhenu pa na Šanghaju. Do teh trgov je pa trenutno, vsaj za malega vlagatelja, dosta težko dostopati. Zato, ker že tudi institucionalci imamo težavo dostopati do notranjega kitajskega trga, čeprav je načeloma že dalj časa odprt, ampak so kar velike bariere in preglavice pri trgovanju na notranjem kitajskem trgu. Tako da,
Kako pa recimo, ali lahko mogoče zdaj ti kot institucionalec, mogoče, ali lahko pišeš, kako izgleda, kako lahko kupiš na notranjem trgu? Kakšen je potek?
ja, potek je, da imajo oni eno tako stvar, ki se jim reče Shanghai pa Shenzhen Connect, do katerega pač, se pravi, ti dostopaš do notranjega trga, ampak težava tehnična je, da recimo poravnave na notranjem kitajskem trgu so v istem dnevu za tuje institucionalce. Se pravi, ponavadi na zahodnih trgih, ko ti kupaš papir, imaš 2-3 nekaj dni časa, da te papirje poravnaš preko banke skrbnica, mislim preko brokerja in skrbnika, in se potem to vse pokniš. Na kitajskem moraš to narediti znotraj enega dneva. Če ne narediš znotraj enega dneva, so zelo visoki penali. Tam ne poznajo nobene tolerance, zelo težko koga pokličeš ali pa mu napišeš mail. Tako da je kar veliko nekih teh tehničnih težav, plus da lahko dostopaš, oziroma tako, tudi malo globalnih skrbnikov ima sedež in v zahodnem delu sveta in na kitajskem. Tako da tudi tukaj si malo omejen. In ja, glih zaradi te poravnave pa dostopa do trga so velike preglavice. No.
Kaj pa recimo, da bi preko ETF-ov dostopal do notranjega trga?
Lahko, ampak je pa tako, spet zaradi tega, ker so Američani, ali pa recimo temu, ker je Zahod uvedel določene sankcije zoper Kitajsko, so vsi papirji, ki so pod temi sankcijami, pač prepovedani za določene tipe vlagateljev. In vsi, recimo temu, tuji brokerji ali pa te globalne banke skrbnice zelo ne rade, oziroma je veliko preglavic ali pa tudi prepovedi glede trgovanja s temi papirji, tako da zaradi tega dobesedno mi ne poznamo nobenega ETF-a, ki bi bil primeren za tujega institucionalnega vlagatelja.
Ravno sem šla na Just ETF in imaš iShare, MSCI China, UCITS ETF, pa imaš cel kup nekih teh China holdingov.
Problem je, če je eden izmed teh holdingov na sankcijski listi strani Združenih držav Amerike, potem ti cel produkt pade. Ni vezan to na sam ETF. Načeloma je, no, ampak tudi tako, vsi tuji brokerji zelo spremljajo stvari v detalj in vejo, kaj noter v ETF-ih je, in če je kjerokoli ime noter, ki je sporno, s tem papirjem ne trgujejo oziroma ga ne poravnajo.
Katero recimo pa je sporno? Katero podjetje, papir je sporen, da ne bi smel trgovati? A mogoče veš iz glave?
Vsi ta velika imena, ki so bila, ne vem, že po medijih, tudi vi ste pisali o tem, kva so bili Huawei, recimo en tak večji je China Mobile ali pa PetroChina, vse, kar diši po nekih vojaških IT, telekom zgodbah, ki bi bili lahko povezani z neko, ne vem, vohunjenjem, vohunsko industrijo, vse te stvari. Drugače pa lahko greste na OFAC stran, tam je seznam v bistvu vseh naložb, ki so prepovedane.
Ok, to je tudi ena taka zanimiva. Vidim, zdaj sem šla pogledat, seveda, takoj direkt, bom tudi link dala v opisu epizode. Kaj pa to, zdaj menda, da se na Kitajskem bojijo deflacije, indeks cen proizvajalcev je v oktobru padel prvič po 22 mesecih, inflacija v septembru je bila 2,8%, zdaj za oktober napoveduje 2,2% inflacijo, če ti podatki seveda držijo.
A veš, spet smo nazaj pa runom, ne? Ali te statistični podatki sploh imajo kakšno težo tam ali ne? Ker če pogledaš, kako bi bilo pri nas, če bi imel, ne vem, če bi ti pa tvoji novinarski kolegi pisali, da je pač deflacija, pa da cene padajo, kakšna bi bila percepcija pri ljudeh? A bi bila podobna, ista, kot je zdaj, ali dejansko ljudje občutijo, da so se stvari podražile, ali je sam ta nek medijski pomp o tem, recesija, inflacija, obrestne mere. Ne vem, veliko je v tem, ustvarjanju percepcije, kaj je resnica, pa kaj ne. In potem s tem pač probaš oblikovati javno mnenje ali pa pač nekako voditi ljudi v njihovem vsakdanjiku. Tako da jaz se bojim, da na Kitajskem tudi malo tega, medijskega spina. Tako da Kitajska je ena tako velika ekonomija, da ima čisto tudi znotraj pač neko svoje življenje. Ja, jaz si predstavljam, da je lahko pa res mogoče realna deflacija tam. Ne vem. Recimo, ker cene komoditijev, pa energentov ne, energente pustimo, ampak komoditijev, predvsem, ne vem, raznih teh industrijskih materialov, železove rude, bakra in podobnih stvari, padajo že kar lep čas, ne? In vemo, da je Kitajska zelo velik uvoznik tega. Tako da s tem, da ima težave njihov real estate segment, si predstavljam, da tudi to je en tak deflatorni pritisk. Kar se tiče hrane, ne vem, če je točno kakšna je bila tam situacija, ampak ja, mlade je tudi tam posledica tega, ne, da ljudje manj trošijo, da imajo res dejansko deflacijo. Težko rečem, ne vem.
Ja, dejansko je res cena tone železove rude upadla iz $200 na $80.
In to ne pred kratkim, ampak že kar nekaj časa nazaj se začel ta trend. Tako da zato me je tudi malo presenečalo, ker so bili še zmeraj tako članki na temo, ne vem, surovin pa gradbenega materiala bolj pisani v to, da imamo inflacijo, pa primanjkuje stvari, pa ne, načeloma osnovni komoditi pa že ne vem, več kaj eno leto v deklajnu. Tako da ja, po mojem se bo te stvari začeli odražati tudi pri nas, no.
Dejva samo mogoče še ta BRIC, no. To je tudi zelo zanimiva zadeva. Kitajska ima čudne relacije do vseh možnih teh BRIC držav, tudi v zavezništvo vabijo Saudsko Arabijo.
BRIC je v bistvu zdaj v zadnjih letih bolj ne, kot karkoli drugega. Ker ta Brazilija po GFC-ju se še ni dobro v bistvu zvlekla iz godle, v kateri se je najdla. Zdaj vidimo, da je prišel na oblast spet stari znanec, ne, ki je bil povezan z enim izmed največjih afer v zgodovini Brazilije, s Petrobrajem. Tako da tudi to nekako kapitalskega trga ne navdaja z navdušenjem in je treba najti zdaj nove akterje, ki bi dopolnili to zgodbo. Te BRIC investicijske zgodbe, no, ki smo bili vajeni. Ampak ja, že dolgo ni več BRIC-a, ampak je sam IK. In upravičeno, zato ker pač Indija in Kitajska imata skupaj skoraj slabe 3 milijarde ljudi. To sta svetova, vsak zase, popolnoma ali pa ne popolnoma, dokaj samozadostna skupaj v bistvu predstavljata en ogromen del že današnje pač pogače bruto domačega proizvoda globalnega. Projekcije za naprej so pa itak primarno odvisne od tega, kaj se bo dogajalo tam.
No, ampak ti si upravljalec premoženja in primarno investiraš v te države, ne samo BRIC, tudi trge v razvoju. Kako v bistvu zdaj, kako gledaš na trenutno situacijo, kako iščeš naložbe, na kaj si pozoren, kako v bistvu v tem res negotovem in čudnem okolju investirati, pametno investirati?
Vsi, ki smo prisotni na trgih v razvoju, več kot 10 let, to ni naš prvi sprehod po tem parku. Tako da na trgih v razvoju se vedno dogaja kaj zanimivega, napetega. In ja, to zadnje dogajanje v bistvu ni nič novega, zato ker je samo še en dodatna epizoda v tej nihajnosti. Pač tukaj se treba zavedati, da so stvari res zelo volatilne in imamo obdobje res enormnih rasti in obdobje res enormnih padcev. Vsi, ki pač stopajo v ta del kapitalskega trga preko svojih naložb, se morajo tega zavedati, da ja, lahko pričakujejo lepe donose, lahko pričakujejo tudi zelo lepe padce. Kako jaz na te stvari gledam in kako v bistvu vlagam v takih trenutkih je, vedno poskušaš najti take zgodbe, predvsem delniške zgodbe, ki imajo nek dolgoročen potencial, se pravi, imajo dolgoročno zanimiv poslovni model, oziroma predstavljajo nek, vsaj trenutno, temelj ekonomije. Po drugi strani imaš pa vedno takih situacijah, kjer je prišlo do res velikega eksodusa vlagatelja, stvari, ki so mogoče padle preveč, ne? Ni nujno povezan s poslovanjem ali pa z poslovnim modelom podjetjem samim, ampak pač ljudje so se odločili, da iz tega trga izstopijo masovno in mogoče so kakšne zgodbe manj likvidne in zaradi tega zabeležijo večje padce. Tako da tukaj se vedno najde mogoče kakšen tak pocket of value, zaradi tega, ker so bile stvari preprodane ali pa prodane v paketu, zato ker se pač kapital seli iz tega trga, ker je nezanimiv kot tak. Do zdaj se je še vedno pokazalo, ker so bili to veliki padci, da so bili to v retrospektivi dost lepi pointi za vstop na trg. Sploh zdaj se mi zdi, glede na so tudi vrednotene relativno nizko v primerjavi, ne vem, s preteklimi padci, da bi znali biti, da bi se ta zgodba lahko ponovila tudi pač letos. Problem je ta, da je trenutna globalna zgodba zelo, recimo temu, majava, ali pa neugodna. O vsem tem, kar se dogaja v Evropi z Rusijo in Ukrajino, z negotovostjo glede pač bodoče energetske predskrbe v Evropi in kako se bo to odvijalo naprej, bomo videli.
A mogoče lahko poveš, katere so bile tvoje zadnje naložbe v zadnjem mesecu, kaj si kupoval po prodaju, recimo? Vem, da to objavljate v mesečnih poročilih.
Ne vem, če bi mi dovolili to.
Aha, no, v glavnem, jaz sem na spletni strani, tukaj gledam 10 največjih naložb. Reliance Industries, sem prav izgovorila. Tencent, recimo, Tencent je tudi en tak zanimiv. iShares, China Large Cap, JD, Alibaba, Infosystem Technologies. V bistvu so ena taka znana imena tudi v skladu, ne?
Ja. Ja, v letošnjem letu je bil, sklad Indija-Kitajska, sem imel kar velik, recimo temu, overweight na Indiji, ki je v bistvu ena svetla točka letošnjega leta. Zdaj v primerjavi, ne vem, s tem, kaj se dogaja v ostalih trgih razvoju, je to res tak success story letos, tako da glavni overweighti ste videli tudi, ali pa med največjimi naložbami je bilo kar nekih indijskih imen. Na Kitajskem pa Tencent, Alibaba, JD, to so te njihovi tehnološki velikani, ampak smo kljub temu, da so pač v skladu zelo, recimo temu, relativno visoke uteži, relativno gledano pač underweight, oziroma imamo nižjo utež v primerjavi z referenčnim indeksom na teh delnicah.
How do you see China's impact on global economy over the, maybe 12 months?
Again, I don't even know what's going to happen
next week.
Yeah, but let me try to make an informed guess, or just throw in some things. And I'll just pick up on my last point. One thing that we overlook again with Xi Jinping is how China actually is doubling down on its integration in the global economy. She has flaunted this dual circulation model, which again is too complex. That if you read the Chinese explanations, it sounds a bit incomprehensible. But the basic idea is there should be, the national economy should be geared both towards, let's say, domestic consumption, domestic development, and so on, but also external. And people have tended to interpret this as China cutting itself off from the world or moving towards self-sufficiency, which in some areas may be true, but it's true in a sense that they need to have a backup option, let's say in semiconductors and so on. But on the other hand, the second pillar of this dual circulation is deepening, links with the world. So it's opposite of, decoupling or cutting itself off, and so on. And I'll mention three things, Vietnam, Germany, and Tesla, which have been recently in the news. The first thing that Xi Jinping did after the Congress was to welcome Nguyen Phu Trong. He's the leader of Vietnam. And it was a really ceremonial meeting. It was a party-to-party meeting. So it was, there were a lot of communist flags, so on, which, for 2022 is a very interesting iconography to see. The point of their meeting was further integrating supply chains in China and Vietnam. And, if you read statements by Western think tanks, policymakers before the Congress, you would think, okay, Vietnam is now becoming an American ally and, taking business from China and replacing China in the global economy. But then, of course, there were also trends of Chinese companies moving to Vietnam, also to circumvent sanctions and so on, but also, to part of a, Chinese version of the flying geese strategy, basically, trying to move, let's say, lower end industries to neighboring countries and bring them along on the path to growth. So this meeting reinforced the partnership between China and Vietnam, again, catching a lot of people by surprise. Then we have the visit by Olaf Scholz to Beijing, which, signified that despite the tough talk in Europe, big European companies, especially German companies, are still, bullish on China. And it was not just Scholz going to Beijing. We had BASF, who's shutting production, some of the production in Germany due to rising costs, opening the largest facility in China. We had BMW moving production from, I think, the UK to China, these mini cars. Europe, especially now in times of crisis due to the Ukraine war, does not have the luxury to decouple from China, at least not to pursue something like the Americans do. And finally, we see Tesla, which has stolen the show. Now it was the International Import Expo, the biggest trade expo in China. Tesla was shining there, and it was praised by Chinese policymakers. Tesla, of course, made a smart move by reducing prices, offering incentives, some special deals on insurance. So it dominated. It still has a lot of catching up with BYD, but let's say it's established itself as the second player in the EV market in China, which again, this was good economic move. Like some people say, they realize that, all those cars that we produced in Shanghai will be very hard to be shipped out of China at this point. So, they have to sell them in China. So this was a smart move. But also, you see Elon Musk, who is in the news
constantly
for completely other reasons these days. But you can see him being also kind of trying to be bridge between the US and China in these tough times. And actually, I think the example of Tesla was referred by people at the trade expo in Shanghai as a demonstration that, American products, Chinese consumers is not a scary relationship. It's completely normal and it should continue to do so. And of course, Tesla was infamous for having opened a showroom in Xinjiang, right? This is a very controversial move because Xinjiang is, the region with the Uyghurs where China is cracking down. China says it's opening vocational schools. Western governments say these are internment camps, concentration camps. It's a cultural genocide and so on. So it's been a big controversy about having any kind of presence in Xinjiang, and Tesla is deciding to open a showroom there, which is again interpreted as Elon Musk being too friendly with China, which, my assumption is that he is, because all these moves suggest that he's also bullish on China. So I would say these are three factors that suggest that it won't be all doom and gloom, right? It's very easy to make a doom and gloom prediction. Just open Twitter, just open the news. There are enough of bad news, but I think there are also some developments that suggest that China will be actually very much involved in, stimulating global linkages in the times of, great uncertainty. And if you add on top of that, as World Bank, IMF are saying that one of the engines of growth after COVID-19 will be infrastructure construction, if you take into account what China is doing at home, Belt and Road Initiative and so on, I think we'll hear much more about China than we are expecting right now.
I think that Elon Musk has his own reasons why he's doing that in China.
Elon Musk is becoming, especially with the Twitter acquisition, he's becoming a player in the global political economy. He's like he cannot be seen. He's originally South African, right? So he's not even American. So he can be seen as this billionaire. And I would here cite, I think it was the Unilever CEO who said that it is to be expected that in times of crisis of legitimacy, crisis of political legitimacy, so people losing trust, especially in the West, in governments and all, it is to be expected that some corporations or CEOs or rich people will assume more of a public role, leadership role. Is this a good or bad thing? I don't know. But it's interesting to see. It's a bit surreal, honestly. Like, I'm more closely now following his Twitter antics rather than his China business, even though this is more up my area of interest. But just the Twitter thing is too interesting to ignore, right? So we'll see. I mean, he definitely has an agenda. I don't know what that agenda is. He now also got involved in, just at the eve of the U.S. midterms, just ahead of the midterms, saying, it'd be good for democracy to vote for the Republican Party, which again is an unprecedented thing. So interesting times ahead.
Saša, mislim, da te čaka zelo pestro leto 2023, 2024, 2025, če boš upravljal ta sklad in verjetno tudi še kakšen glavobol bo pripravil vsem upravljalcem, predvidevam, ne? Kaj ti misliš, kakšno leto te čaka?
Če bi sodil po preteklih podobnih situacijah, bi rekel, da med 2024, smo 2023,
ja, prihtevaš.
Da bo 2023 zame relativno pozitivno leto. Tako da jaz upam, da se pač zgodovina ponovi. Vem pa ne.
No, lep zaključek, pozitiven zaključek. Držim pesti, da se tudi uresniči, tako da iskrena hvala za ta pogovor.
Okay, hvala.
Anastas, I forgot to ask you before, you're from North Macedonia, living in Ljubljana, and you have friends in China. Why you know so much about Chinese politics and economy?
I lived in China, so I studied in China. Like, I first went to China as a tourist in 2009, right? And I knew very little about China, and as every person back then who had no idea of China, I was very kind of, I think, prejudiced. I didn't know what to expect, but I went to China and I didn't expect to see that level of development. I was shocked, I was speechless. And then I picked up some books. I started reading up, and just that whole history of reform and opening up. I'm originally from Macedonia, right? I also studied in Hungary at CEU, and then I did my PhD in Poland. I spent some time in Brussels, so I've been all around. But let's say, being from this region, right, former Yugoslavia, Central East Europe, you name it, of a particular transition, right, and you know a certain version of this history of communism. So, but going in China is a parallel universe, and there are a lot of things in common. Right now, actually, I'm starting a project on a bit. It has to do a bit with the history of the 80s, how actually Chinese reformers were influenced by Yugoslavia. So things that were happening here actually really inspired people over there. But anyway, I went there. One thing led to another. I decided to do a master's there. I did a master's in Chinese politics, foreign policy, and then I did my PhD in Poland, but it was on the Belt and Road Initiative. So frequent trips to China. I worked there, so I don't know. I mean, I really miss it, to be honest. I haven't been there since December 2019. I feel like I don't know it much. Like, what I've been talking to you is mostly like by talking to people and reading up. So my experience has been before, because I was traveling quite frequently, and I was traveling at least once or twice a year. Every next trip, it was a new China. Basically, it was changing so much. So I don't know what will be my next experience. I mean, I'm sure I'll be shocked. I don't know in what way.
And how long did you live in China? And where did you live? Which part?
I lived for 2 years in Beijing when doing my master's in Renmin University. And then I've been traveling for research fellowships again in Beijing. Then I was also doing some organizing events in Chengdu, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Taiwan as well. I was teaching in Shanghai, doing a fellowship in Suzhou. So I've been through a few places.
Okay, Anastas, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion about China, about politics, economy, and everything that's happening there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Tako, to je bila epizoda o Kitajski. Naslednji teden pripravljam novo epizodo o aktualni temi, in sicer kripto. Veliko se dogaja na kriptotrgu, vse zelo budno spremljamo. Imam pa eno zanimivo vabilo za vse tiste, ki bi želeli spremljati snemanje epizode v živo. Se nam lahko pridružite v ponedeljek ob 18. uri. Bova s sogovornikom snemala epizodo. Povezavo do platforme, preko katere snemam, bom objavila na našem Discord kanalu. Povezavo imate v opisu epizode, tako da vabljeni, da se nam pridružite tudi na Discordu, ker se precej dogaja, zelo veliko je nekih odprtih pogovorov na različne teme, tako da vabljeni, da se nam pridružite tudi na Discordu. Toliko za danes. Če imate kakršnokoli vprašanje, mi pošljite mail na marja@money-how.si. Sicer pa poslušajte Money How, ne bo vam žal in lep pozdrav!